Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. We're continuing our look at the topic of business ethics in Chapter 2 of the textbook. And in this particular lecture, lecture number 4, we look at the topic of establishing ethics. We've talked a little bit about what are ethics in the most general philosophical sense, as well as on a practical level. What does it mean to talk about business ethics, and how do we assess behavior as either ethical or unethical? What process, what rubrics, what frameworks are useful to use as practical tools? And in this particular lecture, what we're now looking at is the topic of actually establishing ethics, establishing guideposts for ethics, for what is ethical and good and right in corporate culture. This is a very, very salient and important contemporary topic in the world today. You know that business has gotten a pretty bad rap in media and popular discourse. Many people think that there's nothing good that business can accomplish other than increasing the disparity between the haves and the have-nots and lining the pockets of the wealthy. I am completely opposed to that way of thinking. I absolutely believe that business can be used as a force for good in our world today. And in order to do that, we have to establish corporate and business ethics. So let's talk about that. Company practices and business ethics. Well, if you read textbooks written by academics, you will see common language like two of the most common approaches to formalizing top management commitment to ethical business practice, things like adopting written codes of conduct, instituting ethics training programs at your organization. And my question is that third bullet point. Does that really accomplish anything significant in terms of creating a benchmark for corporate ethics? Let me put it this way. Let's say that you've been working at a company now for 5-6 years. You're now in control of a multi-million-dollar budget in a very important department of your company, and you have been tempted to embezzle $1 million. You sure could use the money, so could your family, so could your children, and you have access to embezzle that money, and possibly no one will ever find out. You're tempted. You're just about ready to hit the button that will secretly move all those funds into your account in a way that no one will ever tell. And then just as you're about to hit the enter button, what crosses your mind? Oh, wait a minute. That very first day of employment, I signed that piece of paper, the ethics code of conduct that says I'm not allowed to do this kind of thing. I guess I can't do it because I signed that ethics agreement. Is that what happens in the real world? Is that what ever happens in the real world? No, my contention would be just because you have a written code of ethics, just because you had an ethics training program a year ago, just because of any of those kinds of things, that's not what establishes business ethics in the corporate culture. Rather, I would tell you the one thing that really establishes ethics is the personal example of leaders and managers. If you want to set the tone and the example for corporate culture and what is ethical conduct, then realize that everyone is always watching the example of leaders and managers, what's really allowed, what's really tolerated, what's really frowned upon, what do leaders not allow and not tolerate. That is really the only thing and the primary thing that sets the example, the tone, that really establishes ethics in a corporate culture. Let me see if I can give you an example from my actual career. You see here two pictures before you, and these represent two jobs that I had at two very different firms in my career. In the early 2000s, I worked as the director of technology for a company in the reprographics industry. And for those of you maybe scratching your head, what is reprographics? Does anyone here know what reprographics is? And perhaps the answer is no. But if I ask you another question, do any of you know what blueprinting is? Well, probably a lot more hands go up, right? Blueprinting is the management of construction data, construction drawings, those kinds of things, right? Really, it's the management of information having to do with construction in the construction industry. I worked for a company that did that in the digital age. So blueprinting is now known as reprographics, and that's the company I worked for. And all of our member companies were in the construction industry. So if you sort of think about what is life like in the construction industry, well, that's sort of what it looks like to work at a reprographics company. Employment is typically 95% male. It's like a construction site. It can be rough and tumble, and the humor can be what you expect it to be with a bunch of dudes on a construction site. When there are ladies working in the reprographics industry, there's only 2 or 3%. They're typically all up in the accounting office. You know what I mean? So the talk on the shop floor is exactly what you'd expect in terms of humor, topic of conversation. It's like being on a construction zone. Now, the image on the right-hand side of your slide, that represents another job I had, working as the head of business development for the 6th largest software publisher in the entire world. And at that particular company, I worked at the American headquarters based here in Pleasanton, right here on the West Coast. My boss was a woman, the head of sales, and her boss, the person who hired me, was the CEO of the American division. She was perhaps the smartest CEO, or one of the 3 smartest CEOs I've ever worked for in my career, and she, of course, also was a woman. So, let me tell you what happened one day in the software publishing company. Because when I got hired on, they asked me, where do you want to sit in the cube farm? And I told them, it doesn't really matter to me because most of the time I'm going to be spending on the phone or out of the office negotiating deals. So they said, fine, we'll stick you in the back there with all of the IT guys. And I love IT guys. I used to manage the IT department in another company, so very comfortable sitting in the cube farm with a bunch of IT guys. Well, we had one guy who was an IT maintenance guy who would fix your computer, young guy, athlete, amateur MMA fighter, like one of these guys with like 3% body fat. And he was always talking smack about ladies, talking about some gal he went out with last week, blue humor. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Well, one day we're all in the break room drinking coffee, and this dude rolls in and he's talking smack about some gal in the accounting department. Hey, did you see what she looks like today and all this stuff? And unbeknownst to him, as he's talking and jawing off, my boss walks in to get an espresso from the espresso machine. She overhears for about 45 seconds what this guy's talking about because he doesn't see her come in. And she says loud for the entire break room to hear, Jason, that kind of talk is unacceptable in this workplace. I will see you in my office in 5 minutes. Well, as soon as we heard her, we're all sort of doing this, right? We don't know who this guy Jason is. We're not part of this conversation. Let me ask you a question. After he went and talked to her in the office for 5 minutes, do you think we ever heard Jason talk like that about a woman again? Not during work hours, not at the workplace. The reason I tell you this story, consider these 2 examples. Consider these 2 workplaces. Talk at the construction data place went the way that it did. Why? Was it because they didn't have the acceptable workplace behavior poster from the EDD posted in the lunchroom? No. Both companies had exactly the same EDD poster in the break rooms, the lunchrooms, because it's mandated by state law. That didn't create ethics and what was acceptable and unacceptable in the corporate culture. What created that was what? The example of leadership. what leadership actually demonstrated, what's acceptable and tolerated, what's unacceptable and not tolerated. And that's what set the tone for the stark difference between one workplace versus another. The point of all this is this: your example matters. As I like to say, you are always setting your own weather. You carry your weather with you. You set the weather around you. Realize that if you are someone with ethics and values, someone is always watching how you behave and how you respond. Someone takes note of what you say and what you don't say. So you have to ask yourself, what is the example that you have been setting? And more importantly, what is the example you will set for the rest of today and tomorrow? Because leaders set the example. They set the tone. You carry your weather with you. And you may say, I'm not a formal leader. That's not the role I have on my business card. I don't even have a business card right now. And I would tell you this: you are always a leader. You always influence the environment around you. You always carry your own weather with you. It's never a question if you're setting an example. You are setting an example. The only question is, when it comes to ethics and values, an example of what is right and wrong, what is good, what is evil, what example are you setting? Because you are setting an example. The only question is, are you taking that seriously and deliberately by your conduct, by your speech, by your behavior? It's really the only thing that establishes ethics in a corporate culture, the example that leaders and managers set in the environment around them. I hope that's helpful. We'll see you in the next lecture.